Evening, everybody. My name is Guy Harewood. I'm chair of the SWT. I don't think you can see me, but you can hear my voice at least. In a moment, I'll hand over to Roy Sexton, who'll be chairing this evening's talk. But first, I just wanted to mention a few things about the webinar itself to help you to enjoy the best possible experience. Firstly, we're recording this webinar and it will be posted on the SWT YouTube channel for public viewing, so please be aware of this when posting questions and comments. If you have any problems or comments, please post these using the chat function. I'll keep an eye on the chat during the webinar, as will my fellow committee member, Melissa. If you have any questions for Greg, please post these using the Q&A function. Now, if anyone sees a question they find interesting, please like that question. The most popular questions will rise to the top of the list and be answered first. So thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the talk, and I'll pass you over to Roy.
Well, Happy New Year, everybody, and welcome to the 135th talk in our Stirling and Clackmannanshire SWT groups winter programs. We've been running these for 20 years now, and in the background there are some of the posters from the original talks that we gave. In those days, the talks were 35mm slideshows, and we used to advertise them by making these posters, which you see in the background, which we delivered around all the libraries and public places to alert people to the programs that we were running. The second slide, and the second slide didn't come up. Oh, good. Oh, there it is. Why did that happen? This is a slide of the January meeting that we held last year. We were never really sure whether to hold January meetings because of the uncertainty of the weather. And were it not for COVID-19, we should probably have been sitting around this evening wondering whether the all hall owners had switched the heating on, and we would be worrying about just how many people would turn out in the icy conditions. So COVID has a bit of a silver lining. Just after this meeting last January, we went into lockdown and we had to abandon all the remainder of our talks program. However, we did manage to get familiar enough with Zoom to run our annual general meeting, at which we changed our chairman to Guy, who you've just seen, and we also changed the vice chairman. The new committee, when it in its first meeting, discussed the problem of these talks, and we agreed to ask the teachers, the speakers that we'd had lined up, if they were prepared to give their talks on Zoom. Now, many of them said that they would be quite happy to do that. However, we felt that we really ought to assess what sort of audience we would get. We didn't have any idea how many of our members actually had the capacity to view Zoom. And Catherine, our new vice chairman, volunteered to give an exploratory talk on reptiles and amphibians on Zoom. We were shocked. 150 people registered for it. That's about 4 times as many as we normally would have had at one of our live meetings. So we decided to go ahead, and Guy, who had become the new chairman in the April, had to hit the ground running, and he took over the responsibility for organising the transfer of all our talks onto an online format. And I'd like to thank him for doing that. It was a bit of a big ask for a new chairman. And now the talks which we've run so far on Zoom have been amazingly successful. I mean, amazingly. I really am shocked The talk on sea eagles, for instance, had 600 people booking to see it, and we could only accommodate, I think it was 504. Well, we hope to continue with these meetings, but one thing we have to do is still resolve how we're going to finance them. And I wanted to say that tonight's webinar has actually been sponsored by our headquarters. So we haven't had to directly pay for it. Now, tonight's speaker, Greg Kenicer, is one of our original speakers who agreed to convert his talk to an online format. This is not as easy as it might seem. The lack of an audience, contact is disconcerting for somebody who's a seasoned lecturer like Greg, and you miss the feedback when people go to sleep, that sort of thing, or you can always sense when they don't understand something. There's also the problem about wondering whether the technology would work. I'm suffering from that now. When I click my mouse, it didn't work just now, and it's very nerve-wracking. You have no idea whether you're actually speaking to yourself or to the audience that you hope is there. Well, Greg joined the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh 20 years ago, and when he arrived, he came as an expert on the genetics and evolution of peas and beans. He also joined the Flora Celtica program. This was a research project whose aim was to document the ways in which native plants had been used in Scotland. Things like herbal remedies that had been kept by families, etc. And it involved gathering information provided by the public. Many of you probably submitted ideas to them. The book that came out of describing the results came out in 2004. It's been very popular, and I think it's on its third print run. Well, Greg seems to have stuck with this project, and in May, last May, he published his own book on Scottish plant law, and you can see the cover there. It's easy to get it online, actually. He has proved to be a very successful communicator, and he has taken part in Landwood, Scotland Outdoors, both of those programs, as well as giving talks at the Edinburgh Science Festival, Book Week, and at the Edinburgh Festival itself. Now, after that introduction, if this was a live talk, I would have invited you, the audience, to give the speaker a warm round of applause. But you're all muted, so we can't do that. So I recorded one early on, and I hope it's going to play. So over to Guy in Alloa, and then Greg in Edinburgh.
I'll just hand straight over to Greg. I just stopped sharing that. So yeah, Greg, over to you.
Great, many thanks indeed, and hopefully everyone can see the screen there. Is that up and sharing okay? I'll just double check. That's always the most ominous bit there, I think. Or here we go. Bring that one. Then check again. And hopefully that's okay. Is that working okay there, Guy? Everyone see that okay? And Roy, many thanks indeed for your introduction there, and for the virtual audience there. That's a very novel way of doing things, and works very successfully indeed. That's cool. Quite gratifying, I have to say, having what sounded like a huge studio audience there, and talking out into who knows how many people. That's what's wonderful. And it's great to see the messages coming up from throughout Scotland and beyond. So it's great having this opportunity to talk to such a nice variety of people. And it will be a talk about magic and medicine, a bit of a kind of focus on these aspects, particularly with the kind of Scottish vernacular plant medicine. So looking at the ways that people have traditionally used plants in Scotland with mostly a medical focus. And it's something that myself and many other people have investigated through the years, and it is quite a fascinating and rich culture that there is that feeds into this, which draws off quite an interesting flora that we have, of course. So one thing that you might suspect when you look at the kind of native flora is that it's, well, some people might suggest a wee bit impoverished, which is probably a bit artificial. But if you look at it kind of in comparison to the rest of the world, we have some quite interesting kind of proportions in comparison to the rest of the world here in Scotland. For example, looking at some of the non-plant organisms, so things like fungi, algae and lichens, we have what seems to be very high proportions of species represented here in Scotland. So, or for the British Isles, for example, we've got over 10% of the known species, seemingly, in the British Isles compared to across the rest of the world. But as you kind of go through a kind of evolutionary series, if you like, and look at the bryophytes, or the kind of the mosses and liverworts, or the ferns, the kind of more sophisticated things with these big kind of fronds and leaves, or the most sophisticated of the plants, if you like, the seed plants, that includes all the flowering plants, pines and yew and all their allies, these proportions drop down quite considerably. And it's quite interesting if you have a look at why that is. In part, undoubtedly, it's because people have done a huge amount of research on fungi, algae and lichens in Scotland. So there's a very kind of good body of research, which means that we know these organisms very, very well indeed. And there's a lot more research to be done throughout many other parts of the world to pick up on that diversity, which will actually bring these percentages down in terms of the proportions that we have here in the British Isles. But these smaller proportions that we have for the more advanced groups, if you like the seed plants, only 0.5% of world diversity is represented in the British Isles, seem very, very small indeed. But there's a really good reason for that. And it still means we have huge numbers of plants, about 1,500 natives in the British Isles and over 1,000 in Scotland that people could work with for traditional plant uses, essentially. The really good reason, of course, is the Ice Age. So certainly with the effects of glaciation scouring almost certainly the vast majority, if not all, vegetation off the land in Scotland, and certainly the vast bulk of the rest of the British Isles, as recently as 12,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago or so, it means it's been a relatively short length of time for plants to colonise. Now, many of these other groups, like the fungi and the lichens, disperse quite well and disperse very widely. So quite easy for them to colonise once the ice retreated. But more difficult in many cases for seed-bearing plants. So we have this relatively low number of plants, but as I say, still many, many plants to work with. The islands aspect of Britain came in about 8,000 years ago or something like that kind of thing. And again, that made it more challenging for some of these larger, showier plants to make their way over onto the island. So yeah, we do have, it's not quite fair to say a limited flora, but a kind of lower proportion of these quite sophisticated, quite evolutionarily advanced groups of plants in the British Isles. But there's one that I have to just stop at briefly, because we'll come back to some references to this. This is Sibbaldea procumbens, a little alpine plant, and it's named in honour of the founder of the Royal Botanic Garden, or one of the co-founders of the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. And that's Robert Sibbald, and he's a really quite fascinating character, a doctor in his time in the mid 1600s and later, and a really quite intriguing person for having collected a whole host of the local plant lore of Scotland, including many medicinal uses. So we'll come back to him, but this little plant here that's named in his honour is truly wonderful little thing. He was very, very close, Robert Sibbald, to having the blue whale named after him, and it's often known as Sibbald's Rorqual. And to be quite honest, that seems like a huge, big, grand thing. He was the first person to describe it effectively for science, but he got pipped to the post effectively by just the rules of nomenclature. So he doesn't have the blue whale named after him. Instead, he has this lovely little alpine here. So if we have a look at what kind of influenced the way that people were using this relatively limited flora in Scotland, we can see there's lots of different groups that were bringing lots of different ideas into Scotland. So you had, once the ice retreated, you had Mesolithic kind of hunter-gatherers coming in. With the Neolithic, you had agriculture, and that had lots of movements of plants, including the weeds as well. So a whole host of what we might call non-native plants as well. Then the Copper and Bronze Age, which were times of conflict and seemed to show some quite interesting kind of archaeological hints in there. And similarly with the Iron Age. And with the movements of Romans into Britain generally, you had a whole host of really quite fascinating plants as well as uses for these plants. So if we look at the Mediterranean, you see that kind of classical world of the kind of 2000 years ago or so, and you had some really quite fascinating writers, people like Pliny, for example, who were recording the natural history and many of the uses of the plants. And these ideas filtered through over the kind of successive 500 and 1500 years even, and made their way up to this little kind of cold corner of Europe, essentially. But lots of other ideas came in through that period too, with the different groups of people that were bringing both plants and ideas in. So it is, in spite of being slightly kind of out on the edge of Europe, Scotland and wider Britain as a whole have a host of different influences that have brought ideas of plants and how we use them as well. So in terms of these ideas, you have this kind of frontier zone. So a lot of the ideas that seem to have come in that are often attributed to, and if you can't see me, I'm doing kind of air quotes, the Romans or the monk, as in groups that we're not quite sure who brought these ideas in, might have been to do with this being a kind of bit of a frontier area, certainly kind of at Hadrian's Wall, for example. So there are some interesting plants that were brought in and interesting ideas that were brought in terms of medicine that might have been associated quite strongly with military uses. You have the Irish groups coming in, so the Q Celtic speaking peoples coming in, who effectively then became the Scots, essentially. So bringing ideas from Ireland. And we'll have a look, this is quite a nice little example here that I really like. This is Philopelingua almaria, which is meadowsweet. Now, I should maybe say I haven't used the common names for plants right throughout this talk. I'll mention them, and if anyone would like to know any or I miss any, then just ask at the end and I can kind of point them out. And I'll show you slightly why I tend to avoid common names, although there will be some scattered through it anyway. But this thing here is meadowsweet. Although it's called meadowsweet and grows in wet meadows, it is of course named after meadowsweet, kind of Anglo-Saxon name, because it was used for sweetening up, seemingly, and flavouring mead, kind of alcoholic honey-based drink. But one of the other interesting factors of it is if you find this plant and you rub a few of the flowers between your fingers and have a smell, you get that strong kind of oil of wintergreen smell. And that's because it's got methyl salicylate in it, and it can be metabolized into salicylic acid, which is essentially kind of the active component you find in aspirin. So this was used traditionally in Scotland. Certainly, if you had a headache, you could just grab the flowers, rub them between your fingers, and supposedly it would banish that headache straight away. But there's a really beautiful Irish myth, the kind of myth of Cuchulainn, where in the kind of myth cycles in Ireland from kind of the Iron Age time, essentially, you have these beautiful stories of the kind of heroic peoples of the time, like they're mythological essentially. And Cuchulainn is obviously one of the champions in these myth cycles. And apparently he and some of his kind of compatriots, when they went into battle, they had this really kind of berserk fury, essentially a bit like berserkers in Viking tradition. And there's a beautifully graphic descriptions of what happens in this berserk fury, where their bones and their flesh turn round inside their skin, and their eyes bulge out their head, and black stuff spouts out of the top of their head, and their skin becomes incredibly hot to touch. And it's beautifully fantastical, this description. Probably not got that much basis in truth, but it's a beautiful image. But apparently, one of the ways that his compatriots were able to calm him down after he entered this kind of battle rage was to dump him into a cauldron of cold water along with a group of different herbs. And this was one of them. And it's quite nice, this kind of concept of these plants being used in this kind of quasi-magical way that also have this active component in them. that does have a medicinal element to it. And we'll come back to lots of other examples of these as we go through. So this is known in Scots Gaelic as Loch Cuchulainn. So to commemorate that, it's one that is very closely associated with this Irish hero. So after that, when you had the Anglo-Saxon influence coming in, you had probably the first real kind of major influence of the classical medicinal tradition. So you had people like Theophrastus and Pliny, who were writing on lots of these herbs and things around the Mediterranean. It took some considerable time for many of these ideas to make their way through to Scotland, probably quicker than we see, but the Leach books that we have for Northumbrian Anglo-Saxon tradition certainly record quite a lot of these interesting uses. A lot of them tie back to these old classical uses. This might have been around the 500s and 600s AD. Also, the Leach books in the Anglo-Saxon tradition do record quite a lot of interesting, more local uses for plants as well. And that's what's quite interesting. You have these different influences coming in, and you've got the local uses as well as these uses from all around the rest of Europe, all intermingling. And it becomes quite intriguing when you see how these change and how people will adapt plants that are being used for the same condition, for example. Really quite fascinating stuff. Then you have the Normans and the Romano-English bringing interesting ideas in, and then the Hanseatic traders later on through kind of the medieval period. And there are some quite interesting kind of particular specialist healer folks. So the Beatons of Mull in the Gaelic tradition were very renowned for their healing abilities as physicians, essentially. And their traditions have a really quite nice mix of local uses of local plants, as well as things that are grounded in the much kind of broader European kind of context as well. So it's a really rich and varied set of uses for plants. And I'll focus mostly on natives, but there are a whole host of really interesting introductions, as I've said, not just of these ideas, but the plants. This is just a couple of them here. And we might typically sort of attribute these to having been brought in by the Romans or the monks, but there really isn't any very good evidence for quite when they came in. They're thought to be archaeophyte, which suggests that they're brought in by people, so they're not effectively native plants, but they've been here for a long time. And in these two plants cases, it's almost certainly because of their use that they were actively and intentionally brought in, not brought in as mistaken sort of introductions. On the left here, these are both members of the carrot family, but on the left we have Ecopodium podagraria, which is many people will know if you've got a garden through the central belt and you've not looked after it for some time, this thing's snuck in, you'll find it really, really difficult to get it out. It's of course goatweed or bishopweed or ground elder or a whole host of other names, which is beautiful. This is a plant that we've got many, many different names for, even though it's not a native plant. But my favourite one for it, of course, is bishopweed or goutweed, because that tells us what it was kind of brought in for. It's thought to have been brought in by monastic communities and used to treat gout. And the idea is that the bishops were the people that would be most likely to get gout, and therefore that's why they had this goutweed in their gardens. So almost certainly brought in as a medicine in itself. On the right, we've got another thing that was probably brought in a slightly different kind of use, was Myrus odorata. So this is sweet Cicely, which grows very well in kind of quite a variety of different woodlands, and seems like it's just beautifully integrated itself into the native flora. And if you've ever got to leaf with this at all, it's got very soft, very sort of pubescent, hairy leaves, quite nice and distinctive, with these funny little silvery patches just tucked in to the base of the feathery leaves there. So quite easy to identify, and even easier when you have a smell of it, because it's got this beautiful kind of aniseed smell to it. Now you can take these leaves and you can strew them on the floor, and then if you walk on the floor, you will get this beautiful aniseed scent wafting up. This plant was almost certainly brought in for that as a strewing herb, in order to scent areas quite pleasantly. So it's effectively like a kind of disposable carpet. And in medieval times, if you were living with livestock, a host of unwashed bodies, and many other folk all crammed into kind of small, dark houses, then you would really value this plant as something not quite so medicinal, but you could just throw it down on the ground and you would have this beautiful scent wafting up, getting rid of the stench of unwashed body. Perfect. A really nice introduction. We've got one more here, which is not necessarily an active introduction, but a sea-drifted seed. And this is a really nice kind of example in Tada. So these are the really large sea-drifted seeds that come from these members of the legume family that have got very huge, big pods, like pods essentially. It's a liana, kind of a woody vine that grows in coastal areas throughout much of the tropics. And the pods will drop down into the water, rot away, and these large seeds will drift for many thousands of miles. Quite commonly, they're found up on the west coast, brought there by the Gulf Stream. And people finding them would take them and not be aware of what they would grow into, because the plants would never successfully really germinate. But they quite often have a heart shape to them, or for some of the kind of related species as well, you get a funny cross shape that appears in this seed. And that was closely associated with the Virgin Mary. And it's beautiful when you see this kind of very close association between religion and medicine coming in, because people would wear these in order to fend off all kinds of ills and all kinds of diseases as well. So yeah, a really nice non-native that's drifted over and been employed in this slightly more magical medicine, if you like. So I'll just say a little bit about sources, and then we'll have a rattle through and look at lots of different plants that are used for different things. So when we look at archaeological sources and other kind of speculative sources, it's quite a kind of an interesting broad range of things that we have there. So in particular, if we are looking at this concept of speculation, it's a bit of a funny one, because we will tend to think, okay, there's a plant and the fruits on it can be eaten. And because they can be eaten and they're tasty, we can assume that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers knew this and they would eat it. But if we don't have any good archaeological evidence, then we can't actually say that for sure. And it's one of the big dangers when you're looking at this is that it's very, very easy to over speculate about how people use things. Archaeology, of course, gives us a huge help in being able to make sense of how people did use things before things were written down historically, essentially. And we are very lucky. There are some pretty amazing finds throughout Scotland. So the really nice find where there's a Bronze Age warrior, or humanly Bronze Age warrior, who has a large amount of sphagnum packed into a wound in his chest. And from that kind of combination, people have speculated, probably with quite reasonable authority, that it was being used in order to try and treat a wound. And in that case, unsuccessfully. But of course, sphagnum is that thing that's used as a wound dressing with its great absorbency of blood, pus, and other kind of fluids you'd find in wounds as well. It was obviously used right through much of the First World War and also into the Second World War as well for this purpose. So very, very valuable and very useful resource that there is there as well. But we've got that great evidence that it was probably used in a very similar way back in the Bronze Age too, because of those archaeological findings. But that's a challenging one, because you have to be very lucky to make such a sort of seemingly lucky find that will give you fairly conclusive proof as to how people were using these plants. So it is quite challenging indeed. And we are very lucky in that we have things that give us more of a concrete feel for how people did use plants in medicine. And that's when things were written down in earnest. And we are pretty lucky, in particular through the 17th century and the 18th century, for a group of different writers who were essentially cataloguing botany of Britain, and also at the same time looking more broadly at the geography of it, which included elements of anthropology and other things as well. And this is some of the kind of people here. We've got Martin, who was travelling round through much of the kind of Western Isles and the Highlands through the kind of late 17th century. We've got Robert Sibbald, who I mentioned, who actually kind of commissioned Martin. I'll mention a little bit more about them in a second. We've got Thomas Pennant, writing some 70 or so years after, and Lightfoot in 1770s. Both of them were bit of gentleman travellers, essentially, but Lightfoot was a botanist, and he wrote the original kind of Flora Scotica. And in doing that, he wrote lots of good descriptions of the different plants that were found throughout Scotland, but also would very commonly include some interesting footnotes and additional bits of information in there as well. And James Robertson, so someone who's kind of often forgotten about because we only have quite fragmentary notes for his voyages, who was writing about the same kind of time. He had a very similar kind of thing, particularly through this Central Highlands area, and recorded, again, just some really nice aspects of how people were using plants traditionally. And the great thing about all these is you can get hold of these works nowadays very easily. So you can quite easily find them online as PDFs and similar. And they're all out of copyright, so go out there and have a look. They're really fascinating little nuggets of cultural history tucked in there. A bit later, people tend to be recording less of the information, essentially. But there's a beautiful shift because this chap here, Alexander Carmichael, was a kind of late Victorian scholar and through into the kind of early 20th century. And over the course of 50 years or so, him and his children produced a series of books that were called Carmina Gadelica. And it's a beautiful set of reference works, which is predominantly Gaelic poetry and sayings and phrases and bits of folklore that have been translated over, sometimes a little bit inaccurately and with a kind of bit of a flowery kind of flourish to it as well. But those are really rich sources of the way that people use plants traditionally, particularly in the Gaelic speaking areas. So we are very lucky. We've got this really strong body of evidence. Admittedly, in many cases, they're written with just that particular writer's take on what they were seeing. So it might be written in ways that are and phrased in ways that are really quite interesting for us to hear today. But yeah, but I guess one of the real heroes of this is Robert Small and Martin that he commissioned as well. So I'll just say a wee bit more about him and then we'll have a look at some of the plans. So he was this founder or kind of co-founder, if you like, of both the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh and the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh. And he was the Geographer Royal as well. So amongst these kind of three roles, that put him in a really kind of interesting position before the Enlightenment really took off in Edinburgh, for example, to be able to look out there at what was at the time the broad geography of Scotland. And as I said, that included the botany, it included the geology, it included the anthropology and cultural history as well. And in providing some really quite interesting books like Scotia Illustrata, and piecing that together from questionnaires that he sent round various people in Scotland, and also a really beautiful book called Provision for the Poor in Time of Dearth and Scarcity, he actually put together the real locus, the real hub of a host of dead interest and information that we have, and lots of that has some interesting kind of medical takes on it as well. By commissioning Martin's tour of the Western Isles, he asked Martin, who was a Gaelic speaker, to go out and go into essentially an area that would just have been very, very alien to many of the English-speaking people that were in the Central Belt, and particularly in Edinburgh itself. And he gathered together a host of really quite fascinating information indeed. Sibbald also commissioned Hortus Medicus Edinburghensis, so that's the first record we have of all the plants that were grown in the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, and many of those were medicinal and were used for teaching and training physicians, and there's a host of different natives in there as well. And finally, Pharmacopoeia Edinburghensis. As a physician, him and his contemporaries developed the first of these pharmacopoeias, and these are the books that are still going strong today that define what the actual materia medica, the things that you use in medicine as drugs, are about. So yeah, a real pioneer in these terms, and we're very, very lucky that we have access to lots of his writing still today. So I'll reference many of these people as I just take a quick tour through various different plants, and we'll have a look at some of the kind of traditions behind these as well and where they came from. So firstly, and perhaps most abstract, is this kind of concept of proper, true magical medicines. And this is one of my absolute favorites. So this is Stag's Horn Club Moss. This is Lycopodium clavatum. And various of the writers, including Alexander Carmichael, record this as being quite an important plant, that if you were out on a walk and you found this growing quite often in fairly well-drained but often well-rained on upland gravelly habitats, quite a common plant indeed, you would pluck a bit of it and you could tuck it into your shoe, and that would be guaranteed to help prevent attacked by the fairy folk. So the arrows of the fairy folk, or the she, were thought to be one of the things that would cause really your milk to sour, or your cattle to be unwell, or for you to have an unexplained illness. It was thought to be a bit like witchcraft, the idea that the fairy folk were causing these inexplicable illnesses, because people didn't have the same diagnostic tools that we have nowadays, that if someone came down with a mystery illness, it had to be the fairy folk that did it. And of course, this plant here grows in the same areas, these kind of upland, what we now look at as heather moorland, where you might quite commonly find the arrowheads, stone arrowheads of Neolithic and earlier Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. These, of course, were the arrowheads that were supposed to have come from the fairy folk and would cause these illnesses. But apparently, for some reason, if you popped a bit of this in your shoe, it would be absolutely superb for keeping the fairy folk away. I wouldn't recommend it though, and it's probably, don't go picking plants randomly from upland areas or anywhere, to be honest, even if you are worried about the fairy folk attacking you. In more recent years, it was used, or certainly a close relative of this, Hupersia, which is a smaller kind of club moss, was used as quite a kind of violent purgative, and also as an abortifacient for kind of procuring abortions as well. Lycopodium clavatum itself, the spores, if you ever felt them, they're really hydrophobic. So they'll float on water wonderfully, and if you rub them between your fingers, they are just exactly like the powder you find on latex gloves. So they were used for latex gloves and condoms to prevent them from the latex from sticking to itself. So yeah, really quite an interesting plant that's been used right through from very early times through to modern days medicine. There are a couple of other, indeed many other plants that were used for this similar kind of warding off the evils of witchcraft or the fairy folk as well. And these are two of the kind of most famous, if you like. Now, these illustrations here are both by some really superb botanical illustrators. I'll pull out a few others of these as well as we go through. But Nicola McCartney's Sorbus ocuparia, this is rowan, is perhaps one of a really nice example of the plant that most people might be familiar with for keeping away the evils of witchcraft and the fairy folk. So many folk have rowans nowadays growing at their front door, which is a wonderful thing still to see going on as a tradition. And probably many people know that the idea is that it keeps away witches. And right throughout medieval times, people would take switches of rowan and fold them round into hoops. And if it was big hoops, you could drive your livestock through, or smaller hoops, you could put them beside a fire and drive the livestock past the fire, and that would help to kind of keep away witches. So it was used as a kind of a veterinary medicine, if you like. And this other one here is Pinguicula vulgaris, the little butterwort here by Linda Russell. We've got some quite interesting, difficult translations of some of the names of this, but the implication is that if you take up butterwort, and again, I would not recommend even slightly doing this, the little root that's under there, the tap root, was bound round into a little ring and then tucked under pails of milk, or it could be put under your pillow, and it would keep away the effects of witchcraft and the fairy folk again as well. And again, it's just this concept of people not really being able to explain unexplained illnesses. You had to have some small talisman or something that would help to ward this off. So yeah, there's not been double-blind trials or anything done on this, but I'm sure there's a couple of PhDs worth in there for someone to research. So here's butterwort here, and it is quite an interesting one. This has got a couple of different broad groups of names associated with it. So we know it as butterwort, but it's also been butter plant or earning grass, which means kind of curdling plant as well in Scots. And ecogurse and urningurse are just geographical variants of that. That was one of its uses, was essentially you would take the plant, drop it into milk, it would curdle it, because it's a little carnivorous plant, this one, and the enzymes in the plant would help to curdle the milk, essentially. And because of that, it was used for producing butter and cheese. But the other groups of names, things like rock grass and sheetroot, these refer to a bit of a kind of livestock or kind of a veterinary medicinal thing, which is a bit of a funny one, because this poor plant had a bad reputation. That if you had your sheep out grazing and they ate butterwort, apparently it would cause this really horrible rotting disease in their feet and their hooves. And this plant got this terrible reputation. This is seemingly based on absolutely nothing, purely because it grows in these wet areas. And if you graze your sheep in wet areas, they will get foot rot. It makes perfect sense. Yeah. So there are lots of these interesting little kind of names that pop up for different plants. So maybe one of the familiar ones for people will be other groups that are called something wort, will tend to relate to their medicinal use as well. And we'll see some examples of these as we go through. There's another kind of nice couple as well. So things like Cardamine pratensis, the cuckoo flower, is a really nice member of the cabbage family that comes out early May, and just a beautiful little meadow plant. But it's also known as bloodweed or blood plant because it's could be mashed up and then used to help to staunch blood from flowing. This one here is another wort, and a quite classic example of that, and really quite widely known throughout much of Europe for its medicinal purposes and its medicinal properties. And it is one where people have made good use of it, and it has a really strong basis in the phytochemistry that's in there in terms of the effects it has physiologically as well. So a pretty fascinating plant indeed. This is St. John's wort, and it's probably known to many folks that it's used as essentially an antidepressant, and it can be quite effective. Now, it has these major issues in terms of contraindications with using with other medicines as well, so something to be very kind of careful of. And to be honest, there's been a lot of investigation done on it, but the mechanism for quite how it works is still not fully known, so people are very cautious with it. But undoubtedly it did have this effect, and that was widely known throughout Europe. And wherever you go in Europe, you find that this same plant develops the name of the most famous saint, because it was considered such a kind of holy plant, such a successful plant. Much of the interpretation for that is because depression and a few kind of similar kind of psychiatric illnesses were very often seen as being the possession by or kind of interference of devils. And it was again this way that people weren't really able to express or understand, in this case, kind of psychiatric conditions in the way that we do nowadays. You had to find some explanation for it. So the influence of devils and possession by devils was what the idea was. And a plant like this that could combat that successfully had to be worthy of the saints. Now, of course, in Scotland, it's not St. John's wort, it's Columba's plant, St. Columba's plant. Okay, and there's a wonderful Gaelic name for it, which translates as armpit package of St. Columba. So the idea behind that was you would take St. John's wort, sometimes stitch it into a little kind of pillow thing and tuck it under your armpit, or you could just take the plant and tuck it under your armpit. And people think that that warm, well, say perspiration rich, but what I mean is sweaty, kind of often hairy environment would mash up the plant, and you've got that slightly thinner skin under your armpit, and apparently that would let the active components into the bloodstream more easily, is one of the interpretations for that. But really quite an intriguing one. So it's got this close association with the church, with this kind of quasi-magical, kind of almost miraculous aspect to it as well. But it does have a basis in the chemistry there as well. Really quite intriguing. It's cool. This next set that we'll look at is something you might have come across before, but it's quite an interesting broad group of plants or way of using plants, a kind of medical tradition, if you like, which is the Doctrine of signatures. And we've got a whole host of different plants that are widely used in Scotland and right throughout much of the area where the Doctrine of signatures was important, which is essentially throughout much of Europe and even beyond as well. And this is a great wee example here. So this is adder's spear or adder's tongue, Ophioglossum, lovely little fern with these two separate fronds. So we've got the photosynthetic frond at the back, the big flat one. And in the center, of course, we've got the reproductive frond, the one that produces the spores. Okay, and that is very, very suggestive of the head of a serpent, hence it gets its name, adder's tongue. And because of that, the idea was you could use it for treating snake bites. And of course, if you got bitten by an adder and you had adder's tongue, or as Lightfoot calls it, adder's spear ointment, you could make this ointment up, which is very often with butter as the main kind of oil that you would hold it in. You would take this adder's spear ointment or adder's tongue ointment, and you would put it onto your wound where the adder had bitten you, and it would be difficult, but you would pull through. And that's brilliant, because you've been bitten by a snake and you would survive. So surely this stuff must work. But of course, the vast majority of people who get bitten by adders will survive anyway. So there's this slightly kind of, you can see how this idea perpetuates itself. And it wasn't really until the mid-1700s where you start getting some interesting comments like this. So this is Lightfoot, who was a doctor and a botanist, saying that the common people sometimes make an ointment of the fresh leaves and use it as a vulnerary to green wounds. So this is probably a bit of a kind of leftover of the idea of actually using it to treat adder bites. And by the mid-1700s, it had become a lot less trendy. Certainly the kind of official physicians had stopped using it because they didn't actually think it had any kind of basis in fact at all. And this idea of the doctrine of signatures was dying out kind of about the same time that the Enlightenment was really taking off, and that they go hand in hand, these two concepts. So things like this lovely lichen here, this is one of the two lungworts that you often hear cited. This is Lobelia pulmonaria, this one here. And if you have got lungs that look anything like this, then I would very thoroughly advise you go and see a doctor right now. Okay, because the idea for this was that this beautiful lichen, this kind of with these quite deep kind of like puckered fissures in it as well, in the thallus and the main kind of body of the lichen, looks like a very, very diseased lung. And that was one of the big ideas for the doctrine of signatures. It could signify the source of the disease, or it could look like the disease itself. So this one here, lungwort, if your lungs look like that, you need to go and see a doctor. And the doctor at the time would have given you lungwort in order to help cure any lung conditions. So used for tuberculosis, in this case, almost certainly ineffectively. But the idea was that the signatures had been put there by providence, by God, essentially, such that the plants and the medicines you could make from the plants would look very, very like the condition that was being used to treat. And another one, of course, is liverwort. And if your liver looks anything like this after the kind of excess of the Christmas period, again, definitely go and see a doctor. So this is these folds of just photosynthetic tissue that kind of cross over each other. This is one species, Clonocephalum conicum, but there's quite a lot of other similar species of liverworts that were all probably used in much the same way to treat liver conditions, or things that had been attributed to liver conditions, which is great. It's a really interesting concept, very widespread, and through from classical times till probably the 1600s before it started to fall out of favour with physicians in the 1700s, but it probably carried on for a considerable time after that in just more local herbal medicines. But there is quite an interesting aspect to this, because people do think that there might have been a kind of mnemonic element to it as well. So if you had a wide flora to choose from, a whole host of different plants, and you were trying to remember which plant it was that cured which condition, you could have had maybe 5 or 6 different plants to choose from. But the easiest way to remember which one would treat which one would be the plant that looks like the thing that it's used to treat. So there might have been a basis in that people won't have been blindly kind of following this concept, that it was used a bit more as a kind of mnemonic memory aid to know what there was you could use to treat various things. Now this is probably our last of our doctrine of signatures one here, and it's quite an interesting one because you never really hear it mentioned at all as using this concept of the doctrine of signatures, but it's dulse. It's an alga, so a kind of red alga, and this is just a quote from Martin Martin. He says that a large handful of the sea plant dulse, growing upon stone, being applied outwardly as is mentioned above, takes away the afterbirth with great ease and safety. This remedy is to be repeated until it produces the desired effect, although summers may be intermittent. The fresher the dulse is, the operation is the stronger, for if it's above 2 or 3 days old, little is to be expected for it in this case. This plant seldom or never fails of success, though the patient had been delivered of several days before, and of this I've lately seen an extraordinary instance at Edinburgh in Scotland, when the patient was given over as dead. And it's a beautiful, really fascinating little snippet. It's all we have on this treatment using dulse in order to get rid of the afterbirth if the placenta wasn't coming out after a child had been born. And it's one of these bits where we could speculate, perhaps, that the plant or the alga, this organism here, looks very similar to placenta. It's got these kind of it's red color and these folds to it, and apparently, if it, that might have been that doctrine of signatures concept, that you could use this thing that looked like afterbirth in order to help expel the afterbirth and thereby hopefully save the mother. Now, it doesn't explicitly say that it's anything to do with the doctrine of signatures, and we don't have any other major references for that. So it is a bit of dangerous speculation, because it might just be because if you take any big, wet, blobby chunk of seaweed and drop it on anyone's stomach, they're going to have huge stomach contraction and it'll push absolutely anything out, I think. I can imagine having lots of slimy seaweed dropped on my stomach. It would, yeah, you'd definitely have a sharp intake of breath with that one. But that, to me, is fascinating. These little snippets where there's the danger of over speculating, but lots of little stories in there as well. Now, one thing that certainly we do have a lot of evidence for, because it crosses over from medicine into culinary use, are what we would now think of, I guess, as superfoods. And it's this idea that you have things that people would eat in many cases, but were actually of some perceived or active medical benefit as well. And certainly seaweeds were seen as one of these kind of groups of things, for example. So there's quite an interesting reference here to this daberlox, which is quite a sort of deepish water seaweed. It's one that you only find thrown up on the beach, or if you go snorkeling or diving or swimming out with a mask on, you'll see it kind of in kelp beds or rocks near kelp beds, essentially. It was really quite interesting plant, but there's a few little references to it being used to treat pica, which is quite odd. So it's this condition where people feel compelled to eat non-foodstuffs, so stones and things like that kind of thing. And we have a few references to daberlox being used to treat this compulsion. And again, we don't have a huge amount of information for it at all, but just these little references. We've got much more information, however, on this one here on the right. This is Chondrus crispus, this is carrageen. And what we've got here is a carrageen competition up in South Uist, I think it was, where people had made the ultimate carrageen puddings. Now, it's superb. The carrageen has got carrageenans in it, which are used as a gelling agent, and you'll find it in many modern foodstuffs that are used as a kind of vegetarian gelatin, for example. And they are algopolysaccharides, so they're the things that act a bit like cellulose or lignin would in land plants, but in algae, they're used so that the plant uses them as part of the structural tissue, but also in order to be flexible, so they can move with the waves as well, which is a pretty useful, versatile thing for the plant to have. But people have harvested carrageen for many, many years, particularly through the West of Ireland and through the kind of Gaelic-speaking areas of Scotland, but actually right throughout much of the British Isles at one time or another, and used it as a thickening agent. And carrageen puddings are really quite interesting because you can take the carrageen, drop it into milk, boil it up, and it'll thicken the milk up. And you can get things that are very, very solid jelly, or just quite a runny kind of jelly. And then you can add all kinds of flavorings. But anytime I've ever made it, I've found you need to add twice as much flavoring as you expect, because carrageen is incredibly bland. And that's one of the kind of big things about it. So if you were recovering from some kind of stomach condition, you would always have carrageen pudding, because it's quite inert. It won't interact with your system. You won't try and digest it because it's this algopolysaccharide. And in fact, carrageen is very closely related to the alginate group of chemicals. And if you ever have, this is in no way an advert, but Gaviscon or any of these kind of things that you have, if you've got heartburn, then they almost always have an algopolysaccharide in that helps to coat your throat and stop irritation. So yeah, a superb thing, a bit like a superfood, but it was also kind of eaten at the time. There's another one here, which another coastal one is scurvy grass. So on the right, we can see this thing with these little sort of spoon-shaped leaves, illustrated beside Thrift and a Coastal Grass by Morna Henderson. And there's a beautiful quote by Martin Martin that explains its use as a superfood as well, to a degree anyway. And he says that this rock, which I think he's talking about an island near St Kilda, a small rock near St Kilda, I think, affords a great quantity of scurvy grass for an extraordinary size and very thick. The natives eat it frequently, as well boiled as raw. Two of them told me they'd been confined on the rock for the space of 30 hours by a contrary wind, and being without victuals, fell to eat scurvy grass, and finding it of a sweet taste, far different from the land scurvy grass, they ate a large basketful of it, which did abundantly satisfy their appetites until their return home. They told me also that it was not the least windy or any other way troublesome to them, which is beautiful. A really nice, rich account of people eating scurvy grass, being connoisseurs of it, so knowing the different flavours of it, for example. And of course, that name, scurvy grass, is because, like many plants, it's rich in vitamin C, so people would eat it and it would help to fend off scurvy. Now, the plant, unfortunately, is very like rocket in a way. I don't know if anyone's ever eaten scurvy grass, but it's got it's a member of the cabbage family. So it's got a lot of mustard oil in it, sometimes a huge amount, so it's very unpleasant, so much mustard oil in it. But essentially it tastes like a strong rocket. And you know what happens if you ever got rocket and you leave it in the back of the fridge, it goes that horrible kind of mushy, disgusting brown, and it will rot away really quite quickly. And in part, it's probably because it couldn't be preserved that people didn't use scurvy grass for the Royal Navy at all. And it was citrus fruits which could be preserved that were used to help to combat scurvy instead. But this is the original thing that you would have had. Waimies, sailors, would have eaten lots of this because it's a really abundant and common coastal plant indeed. And it's also interesting to see how Martin mentions about flatulence, which seems to be a major topic that he's quite into. And if you read a lot of these writers through the 1700s, when they're talking about medical conditions, they will talk about flatulence, about bloating, about the temperature of a person, about the colour of a person, about a few different things. Again, because they don't have all these different diagnostic tools that we do today, they were actually quite limited in what they had to go with in terms of diagnosis. So people seem unduly obsessed with what their gut was doing at the time. So something for everyone to think about after Christmas success, I think. This one here is Ramsons, so a very lovely woodland plant there, and it's one of several different garlics that were used to combat the gravel, essentially, which is just like kidney stones, but small kidney stones. So people would eat onions, but very commonly this was thought to be the most effective, the wild native Ramsons, in combating like small kidney stones, essentially, gravel. But also it was chopped up with butter, and if you had a boil, you would have Ramsons or onions as well, chopped up in butter and put on a boil, and it would help to draw the pus as well. In a similar-ish way, blaeberries or blueberries are often written about as being as much medicinal as anything else. So you would have people go and harvest blaeberries, and there's a whole host of places around called Blaeberry Hill, where they were harvested in large quantities with essentially giant metal toothed combs, where people would just scrape the berries off into baskets, take them down and sell them at market. But probably the bulk of the people that were eating them would have been aware that they were used in treating constipation. So they had this kind of medicinal kind of element to them as well. And then we have possibly my favourite. This is an illustration by Sarah Roberts, and this is a Lathyrus. This is a member of the pea family, bitter vetch, which you can find growing in acid grassland and kind of upland heath as well. And it's a wonderful wee thing. It's one of the very few members of the sweet pea group which has got underground tubers like we see here. So this large underground tuber was very commonly dug up and chewed by people. So particularly in Gaelic speaking areas, although there's records from throughout Scotland and a bit further afield as well. And this is one of the kind of interesting, fairly local uses that there are. So the idea behind that was it had this kind of licorice taste, and it would help to give people a bit of energy, help them work in the fields, and allow them to kind of keep a clear head was one of the kind of ideas, as well as suppressing appetite. And these are quite intriguing kind of mentions of how these plants could be used. And people have started to look nowadays at what kind of chemical compounds there are in the plants that gave these accounts of these almost medicinal, almost magical uses for things like bitter vetch here. But the jury's still out, so we're not sure whether or not actually they could contain some quite kind of dangerous compounds. And it's an important thing to say for a lot of these medicines, that remember people in the 1700s and 1800s had much shorter lifespans than us. and things like this could be one of the reasons. Okay, I'll jump on and rattle through a few others because time seems to be getting on okay. This is just a few things where we've got a few uses that we don't quite know where they come from, but horsetails were no longer used for blood in the urine or gonorrhea in Lightfoot's day, and we get these interesting mentions again by many of these people writing in the 1700s about how times were changing and how what were previously quite useful medicines had become less trusted over time. And then just beautiful little mentions like this. So this is hart's tongue, and down at the bottom on the right hand side we've got one of the wall spleenworts as well. And Martin just mentions that these two brewed together produced a beer that was used in combating consumption. And consumption, of course, is a form of TB. So it's a lymphatic TB. And that's just beautifully intriguing, because if there was any basis to that, and any of the compounds that were in there were successfully usable for treating TB, we might have some interesting future ways of treating what is a resurgent disease. But I just love the concept of drinking a beer and helping to combat tuberculosis. It's a beautiful idea, really good. But it was also used more widely, the Sesquinium trichomanes, as a kind of a tea or a syrup in coughs. And quite often these plants would have associations with one particular group of complaints, so thoracic or kind of similar kind of cough and chesty complaints. This one here is a really nice one for royal fern, a relatively kind of uncommon fern, but a beautiful one when it's up and growing. That a cool poultice of the roots of royal fern was applied to a dislocated knee in one particular case, and forthwith the pain stopped, all the swelling disappeared, and the kneecap went back into its original place. We've got some of these lovely little snippets of stories of these things as well. Lightfoot mentions some interesting fungi. So he talks about this puffball here is a lycoperdon, or one of the kind of common puffballs that you find. And right through from ancient times through till certainly the 1700s, these little puffballs were taken before they puffed and opened, and they were pummeled flat, and then they were used as a styptic to kind of help to prevent loss of blood, just from kind of small wounds, for example. And on the left-hand side, we've got Auricularia auriculajudi. So this is the kind of ear fungus that you find growing on elder trees, and it was recorded as being used in milk and vinegar for sore throats, or also when you hydrate it, it's got a very fleshy texture, and you could use it to pick up other medicines and wipe them onto wounds, for example. So used as a bit of a kind of swab as well. We've got things like juniper, so often called savin. Even though Juniperus sabina, the kind of true savine, is Mediterranean and really quite toxic, unlike Juniperus communis, and it is kind of most commonly used as a kind of an abortifacient, and it's the one that has that sort of slightly black reputation, the kind of dodgy reputation in terms of having been used by one of Mary Queen of Scots' maids for procuring an abortion, essentially. So certainly kind of obstetric medicine was a real kind of challenging thing at the time. You've got things like these, so a beautiful mention in Lightfoot again of iris, so this yellow flag, and Bellis perennis, the daisy, both of them kind of pounded together and then poured into the nose if you had toothache at all. But the big problem was you would have this terrible side effect that they often mention, is the person would keep sneezing for a long, long time. So their toothache would apparently go, but they would end up with this kind of chronic sneeze. So not a great return on that one, I don't think. Another interesting one for iris was this. So there's a whole host of different ways that plants were used. And probably the roots of flags, or yellow flag, this iris here, along with salt water and butter, were used as a kind of a general tonic, but in the form of a glister, which is essentially an enema. And enemas were a really common way of delivering many of these medicines. I should have maybe mentioned it's not entirely appropriate for a family audience, this. I think it gets a bit grisly. And then we've got things like this, and this is a really quite intriguing one, because bog bean is a nice kind of speciality we'll often find growing in appropriate kind of peaty lochs and things. It's a great wee easily identifiable plant, and yeah, really quite striking indeed. But it's the classic kind of bitter tonic that people would take as a bit of a kind of preventative, as well as being used for a whole host of different things. So the upper surface of the leaf was used for kind of rubbing on wounds, and the lower surface for drawing out pus. You could use it for ulcers, for dermatitis, for acne, a whole host of different kind of skin complaints. In Shetland, it was used for jaundice, in Lewis for heart problems and asthma, and in used for constipation as well in animals as humans. So a really huge range of different uses for this plant that all seem really quite surprisingly local. So very local areas would have their own particular uses for a plant, as well as the much more kind of general, in this case, tonic. So in many places, even still today, you do have people will take a bit of bog bean, often the leaves, put them into a jar with water, and every so often they'll sup this kind of really quite bitter tonic from there, and supposedly works wonders. And then we've got these. So these are quite intriguing, where again, no matter where you are through Europe, there would have been this idea of using plants that would cause blisters, the sap of them. So if you were in Southern Europe, you would very often use euphorbias, members of the spurge family, where you would take some of the white milky sap of those, put them onto your skin, and it would raise a blister. And that blister would have essentially clear fluid in it. You could lance the blister, and that would get rid of the bad humours. And this idea of balancing up the different humours in your body was obviously a kind of a critical thing in historical medicine. More locally here, the plants that were used for that were things like marsh marigold and Ranunculus flammea, lesser spearwort here on the left. And these members of the buttercup family have this quite acrid sap, and they're the main ones that were often used. So chopped up, put in a limpet shell, and then the limpet shell was put onto your arm or wherever you wanted the blister to raise. Up would come the blister, and then you would just stab it with a pin, and out would come the bad humour, and you'd be right as rain in no time. We do also have this other one here, is Ficaria verna, lesser celandine, and it was similarly used. So it was actually quite a strong kind of thing for raising quite large blisters quite quickly. But it's a really interesting one as well, because the roots of this Ficaria verna, with this beautiful name, lesser celandine, they look very like a cluster of, I'm afraid to say, hemorrhoids. And for that reason, this was, of course, known as pilewort and used to treat hemorrhoids as well. So I hope we're doing okay for time. We don't have too long to go at all. Are we okay, folks? Yeah, perfect. Good. Just a few more just to mention for some quite kind of local uses as well. There's a few quotes we have, and we'll have a look at a few boxes to finish up. So this is a nice one by Martin mentioning something very kind of quite specific with quite a nice involved recipe, where he says the tops of nettles chopped small and mixed with a few whites of raw eggs applied to the forehead and temples by way of a frontal. A frontal is another one of these things, like a plaster you put on your forehead, is used to procure sleep. And on Gia specifically, some of the natives told him that they used to chew nettles and hold them to the nostril to staunch bleeding at the nose, and the nettles being applied to the place would also stop the bleeding at a vein or otherwise. And these beautiful wee snippets are superb for just giving us some interesting insights into very, very local uses of these particular plants. And he mentioned some others as well. This is Robertson mentioning that in consumptive cases, there was this 90-year-old gardener. He used a syrup made of the roots of nettles, together with the leaves of salvia, so sage, and hyssop. And amongst them, he was able to give this decoction to people, which would help again cure tuberculosis. So again, some really quite interesting things there that could be used for future investigations. And then we'll just go to one slightly more familiar thing, something that we will still use in more recent times, although it has fallen out of fashion, and that's through seaweeds again. So kelp and burning kelp, like we can see here. So taking lots of the brown seaweeds and burning them on the shore and getting the ash from that, which is a very kind of mineral-rich ash. So lots and lots of soda, potash, and a considerable portion of iodine there, where big industries right throughout many of the coastal parts of Scotland from the 1600s onwards until the bottom fell out the industry in the 1800s, just kind of preceding the Highland clearances essentially. So probably the industry failing here was one of the reasons that the Highland clearances ended up happening, as the lairds wanted to move people off and bring sheep on once the very lucrative kelp business had failed. And it's quite intriguing because initially this seaweed was burned for soda and potash, in particular for bleaching cloth, for bleaching linen, for making glass. But over the years, as substitutes came in for those, the industry shifted into the production of iodine, which of course was being used in many cases as an antiseptic. But then other ways of producing iodine artificially were discovered. And because that failed, that precipitated the failure of the kelp industry and ultimately the Highland clearances. So these things that are tied up very closely in culture and medicine have had huge effects on the people throughout Scotland as well. And then we've just got a few more to look at, which are ones that we see through in medicine today. And these are classics. So Digitalis purpurea was used in the kind of the proper, sort of, if you like, medicinal pharmacopoeia as recorded by Sibbald and many of his contemporaries in dropsy. So dropsy being this kind of a swelling condition that can be associated in some cases with heart conditions. And the compounds that are in Digitalis are obviously able to regulate heart rhythm to a degree, very, very successfully in many cases. And the big problem with it is, of course, you've got a very thin margin between overdosing and getting into very dangerous kind of condition and giving the right dose to be able to achieve this kind of success. And so that's well known that Digitalis purpurea was used for heart conditions, and digitalin and digoxin are still used today in similar ways, but artificially synthesized. But it's just quite interesting to see these other uses that this plant was put to. So as a kind of poultice for swellings, and in Lochaber in particular for drawing pus, bad knees and diphtheria, also for helping people to be sick if they'd eaten anything inappropriate, so an emetic or cathartic as well, and also for pain relief. So if you had a fever, people would be given Digitalis, small amounts of it, or the leaves would be laid on their forehead in order to help to bring them through their fevers. They're really quite intriguing uses. And then we've got this wonderful thing here, and then just one after that. This is Deadly Nightshade, Tropa belladonna, so debatably native, but it's kind of by the by. And it's just wonderful. This particular plant here is one that was photographed in an area just across the road from the Botanics in Edinburgh, where Duncan Flockhart and Company used to have a huge area that would cultivate ferns that were used for producing worming agents, a Tropa belladonna that was used as essentially for many of the same uses it is today. So Deadly Nightshade, which is used to dilate the pupils, because the atropine that's in there can be used as a kind of dilatant. It can also be used to treat low heart rate as well. So you can, if you've got bradycardia, you can use atropine to increase the heart rate if it's given at the right dose as well. And nowadays also, in cases of organophosphate poisoning or things like use of nerve agents as well, atropine is one of the first go-to things you can use to treat these. Now, of course, when Duncan Flockhart and Company, this big pharmaceutical company in the late 1800s and 1900s, were growing it near Edinburgh, it wasn't being used to treat organophosphate, but for many of these other conditions in itself. So yeah, we still have these legacy plants growing near the Botanic Gardens from a time when it was grown en masse for use as a medicine. And our very last one is this, which is wonderful because it's one of our most toxic plants. But of course, these toxic plants very often have an interesting medicinal use. I'll just finish up with a quote from Carmichael, which I think is wonderful for describing the use of hemlock. So he says, a cold poultice of hemlock was applied to a cancer sore. The hemlock plaster was so hot and so strong that it drew the cancer out from the bottom. The roots coming with the cancer as the roots come with the hemlock itself out of the ground. This idea of the doctrine of signatures in there, with the kind of long roots of the hemlock being like the roots on this cancer sore. And then it said this was effective when done in time. When the disease became soft, nothing could cure it. A police inspector in Glasgow had cancer in the lower lip. Instead of having it cut, he went to his native home near Fort William. There, a man applied a poultice of hemlock to the lip and extracted the cancer bodily. The patient told my informant that the pain had been excruciating. The flesh containing the cancer came away, carrying the roots with it. These were very numerous and resembled the fine, thready roots of hemlock. You could hear the sound of their breaking away. The patient placed the cancer in spirits and kept it for many years. My informant said that except for a hollow, the man's lip seemed quite healthy and normal. And that's just an exquisite sort of use of kind of, well, like we do today. We have these chemotherapeutics for cancer, but then married in beautifully with this idea of the doctrine of signatures and a healthy dose of storytelling. And I think that's what says a lot about traditional plant use in Scotland. There's lots of storytelling in it, but almost always somewhere there's a grain of interesting truth as well. So folks, thank you very much, and I hope that's not run over far too long.
It looks like we've had quite a few questions.
Oh, nice. Cool.
We've got 14 in total, so
Nice.
just a few to go through.
Cool.
So the most liked one is, does sphagnum have any antiseptic healing qualities other than being very absorbent?
It probably does. So people have looked at it a bit, and almost any organism has to have its own kind of self-defense to be able to kind of get rid of bacteria and fungal defense as well. But so I wouldn't know the kind of exact compounds that are in there, but yep, it's been demonstrated to be antiseptic in that regard. So.
Okay. Plants are attacked by viruses. Have they evolved any chemicals to control them that might be useful to us?
Antivirals are quite a difficult bunch in terms of plant thing, because many of the chemicals essentially that you take from plants won't be so good for antiviral compounds necessarily. They're more antibiotic, kind of antifungal, or they'll have a kind of direct physiological effect, like things like the atropine that we saw there. So I don't know. I don't know any great examples, but there might well be.
Were all the medicinal uses known in Britain if plants did not belong or originate here?
That's a question. For almost certainly not. And it is quite interesting when you have a look at the patterns of how people were using the plants. In particular, you'll have something in Pliny that's written 2,000 years ago, where he'll be talking about a plant that he describes, but even botanists today find it really difficult to identify what he was talking about, because he'll describe it in a few words. And basically, wherever that idea went in Europe, people would find the plant that closest matched to Pliny, and they would try their local plants. But you also have a whole host of really hilarious things in these classical writers, where people were the suggestions of how they were used for medicines that were never picked up elsewhere when the ideas went further afield than the Mediterranean. So yeah, there are some good examples for those, but in many cases those are the ones that are probably a bit more magical. So it's maybe a bit easy to suggest that people didn't quite trust them.
Yeah. An add-on to that last question is, give me a second. Similarly, did the linguistic origin of the common name travel with the knowledge of a certain use of a plant? This lady knew meadowsweet as Medesus in German. I hope I pronounced that right.
Interesting. And I wonder if that is that coming through from the same root, from meadow sweeting or sweetening up mead, or from its habitat, because it's quite an interesting one, because names just change and transform all the time. So when we think about meadowsweet, we only really think of that as sweetening up, as because it grows in the meadow, and it's become queen of the meadow as well. So it's obviously taken this mead through from Anglo-Saxon, and it's been converted and corrupted over into meadow as well. And the same idea with fox's glove is an Anglo-Saxon thing, which is fox's clover, which is the glove of a fox. Definitely 100%. But of course, and I'm guilty of this as well, it sounds much nicer if you treat it as folks, as in the fairy folks glove, because that's more romantic sounding. And this kind of Victorian construct for the name, folks glove, named after the fairy folk, is a much more recent invention, but actually it is the thing that foxes should put on their paws.
That explains why you get so many illustrations with fairies and foxglove flowers.
Absolutely, yeah. There's nothing to do with fairy. Well, probably there are other things to do with fairies and foxgloves. Yeah.
There is a lady that says, I'm interested to know more about Lathyrus linifolius. Are there any groups working on applications for it as a stimulant and appetite suppressant? Well,
we're myself and some other folks are having a look at it from a few different kind of perspectives, and it's a really interesting one. So if I don't know if my email is available, if anyone did want to get in touch, and I could have a chat through. It's got a really interesting history, and there's a whole talk's worth in there for sure. But it's one where we're just a wee bit unsure if it's if it would be applicable today, and it probably needs a lot of work done on it to determine whether it's safe or not, for example. So we're absolutely kind of holding off recommending it to anyone, I think, until much more.
There's some interest in looking at plants and their uses in the Western Isles. The person would like to know where they can do some research. They live in Lewis.
And so if that's kind of contemporary, like current research, then we've got a database that's one of these classic databases that it will be published every so often and then gets old, and then it needs to be republished, and it's currently in a kind of hiatus phase. But we've got some really nice records from the Western Isles. But if they're interested in finding out about historical uses, then certainly Martin and Alexander Carmichael's historical uses are really great places to start looking at some of these uses. And then again, it might be worthwhile if people did want to get in touch with me just at the Botanic Garden and send an email. If you see my surname there, it's not difficult to pick up my email address, I suspect, and get in touch, and I could certainly be back in touch and point you in the direction of some useful sources, depending on what you want to investigate.
Do dock leaves really counteract nettle stings?
Yeah, they do to a degree. So yeah, I mean, like I think I've seen the kind of antihistamine things being demonstrated enough, but in probably much the same way that almost any, I'll be very cautious about saying this, but lots and lots of plants are great sources of vitamin C, so they're good at countering scurvy. I guess there's a lot of plants that will have some antihistamine component, but docks might not then end up having any other compounds that cause more irritation. Might be one of the kind of elements. So yeah, seen that. But bog myrtle isn't quite so effective against midges as people often suspect. That's been nicely demonstrated.
At the risk of this, the answer to this next question being quite long, if you could keep it relatively short, that would be good. Can you talk more about seaweeds? There is a revival in harvesting or for eating, and I'm interested in the taste and uses for different varieties. So there's no specific question in there.
But that's another full chunky talk. So I guess that when I very first got to the garden, the first bit of research stuff that I did was particularly on seaweeds and the traditional uses. And there's a really nice sounding PhD that someone's just doing now, looking at old seaweed kelp burning sites as well for an archaeological side of things. So there's a lot of really interesting active research going on about it now as well. Certainly Harriet Watt, their outstation up in the Orkneys at the campus up there, is doing quite a lot of work on that as well. So again, that might be best done through email, and I'd be happy to have a talk about it at some point with individuals or a bigger talk. But yeah, it's a fascinating group. No, I know.
My understanding is that later generations of the Beatons were sent to Europe to train as healers. Are there any remedies known to have been brought back from there that continued to be used in the local tradition?
Was that continued as in historically when they were brought back? That many of
it doesn't say. I think so.
Yeah, so I think certainly the Beatons were quite a kind of cosmopolitan and renowned family for their medical expertise, and it was, I guess, many of them were trained in Europe, and I don't know if there were any particular plants or treatments, any particular plants that were brought back and locally used in Mull and the surrounding areas where they weren't otherwise used throughout other parts of Scotland, I guess, as well. But there might have been some individual kind of short-lived examples of the actual treatments themselves as well, because there's a really big range of different things used. However, when the pharmacopoeia came in and standardized medicines for everybody through kind of early Enlightenment times that did restrict down what people were using in order to try and make it safer for everybody. So a great many of these kind of more local uses and the more fringe uses might have disappeared, and it might have become more standardized for everybody, including the bees.
Is milk thistle really useful for treating liver disease?
I'm in no way qualified to answer that one, I'm afraid, at all, for
Quite
stuff
a
you
few
know.
questions like
I'd be cautious. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. A lot of information is out there and available, but a lot of it just really is difficult to know what to trust. So I'd be very, very cautious, and I would absolutely emphasize that any of the things that I've suggested, do not try them at home whatsoever. Okay.
How can anyone be sure that a plant identified from the Neolithic period was actually a foreign weed and not a native plant?
Oh yeah, that's a really nice one. You can't be absolutely sure, but the kind of hints that people will have for it are if you have modern distributions where they're found, for example, Myrrhus odorata, sweet cicely, does really well in the central belt of Scotland, essentially, but then it's not really found in intervening places where it should grow until you get to its supposed native areas, really, in continental Europe, so central continental Europe. So because it's got what feels like a very weird distribution, it doesn't have a kind of natural seeming basis, and these quite large fruits that would never have been able to fly or float seemingly over to Scotland, we're pretty, and because it's useful, we're pretty sure that it's one of these archaeophytes. And you can, if you're going back to Neolithic times, you can get a similar kind of feeling for things, but it becomes more difficult. Also, to be honest, with many of the non-native plants that are here, they're establishing themselves as part of the flora anyway. So we have a very, very different flora from what would have been exclusively native. And it's that interesting mix of intentional non-natives and unintentional non-natives, and then those very, very few that become invasive as well.
Is butterwort as mothan the plant Alan Garner used in his novel Moon of Gumrath?
Oh, it's been ages since I've read that, actually. Do you know, I wonder if it will be, because if it's mothan, then that's an interesting one, because the name that was there for butterwort comes from Alexander Carmichael, and it's got this really strong kind of magical, mystical, fairy folk association. But there's a couple of names in Alexander Carmichael's Carmina Gadelica which are mothan and tauronin, and when you read the descriptions of the plants that he's actually talking about, they don't quite sound right. So I'm a little bit suspicious when I see that as butterwort for necessarily being exactly the right thing. So if you are trying to keep the fairy folk away or prevent witches from, you know, assaulting the milk in your fridge, then I go with Rowan every time. Definitely, it's safer.
And on to the last question that we actually have time for. Do you have any thoughts about using the seeds of giant hogweed in culinary medicinal applications as you would common hogweed seed? It's my understanding that the dangerous compounds in the plant are found in the sap, making the seed fair game.
So again, I wouldn't say definitely do use anything for stuff, but that's right. The sap is this, it's a sorrelin kind of chemical compound. So it does that thing where it's on your skin and then it's UV reactive. So if you have ever, what the other classic plant that's very closely related to hogweed and giant hogweed is parsnips. So if you cut parsnips tops and rub them on your skin and wander around on a sunny day, you'll get these blisters coming up. Okay, but we all eat parsnips and they're perfectly delicious. And hogweed was you know widely eaten as well, and kind of used for sugar sources for beers as well. So in principle, I can imagine it might be similar, but please definitely don't try it at home and don't tell anyone that I said you could.
I'll pass over to Guy to wrap up now.
No, thank you.
Yep, just a few closing words from me. Firstly, Greg, I'll echo the a lot of the comments that are flashing up here as we were doing the Q&A. That was a truly fascinating talk. As an ecologist, it was really interesting to look at plants from a slightly different perspective than usual. So thank you very much. And thank you, Roy, for putting in the effort to organise this in the first place. So I'll close it down and we'll leave it there. So thanks again, Greg.
Thank you, folks. Thanks.